The silence in my workshop usually felt like a warm blanket, familiar and comforting. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light piercing the grimy window, illuminating stacks of specimen jars, meticulously labeled slides, and the skeletal remains of a small rodent I was studying. My world was small, contained, and exactly how I liked it. Outside, the city roared, a distant, uninteresting hum. Inside, it was the quiet whisper of insect wings, the faint scent of formic acid, and the slow, predictable march of decay. Then the insistent buzzing of my ancient landline shattered the peace. It was a sound I hadn't heard in months, a relic from a life I'd deliberately shed. My jaw tightened. Who could possibly know I was here? I let it ring, the shrill insistence grating on my nerves. Finally, with a sigh that felt like it scraped against my ribs, I pushed myself up from my workbench. My knees popped in protest. A familiar complaint. The receiver felt heavy, alien in my hand. User Oj, I stated, my voice rough from disuse. A clipped, professional tone answered, devoid of warmth. User Oj, Detective Miller, we need you. My first instinct was to hang up. Detective Miller, the name sent a faint tremor through me, a phantom echo of a time I tried to bury. I'm retired, I said, the words tasting like ash. I don't do that anymore. This isn't a normal case. User Oj, it's different, baffling, and frankly, we're out of our depth. The brass is breathing down our necks. Detective Miller's voice sharpened. They said you were the best, that you understood things others didn't, about time, about what happens. I closed my eyes, picturing the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation rooms, the grim faces, the questions I could no longer bear to answer. I deal with insects, I said, trying to keep my tone even. And decomposition. That's all, exactly, and that's why we need you. We've got a body, or rather we had a body. It's like the clock's been reset. The scene is at the old waterfront warehouse. We'll send a car, you don't have to stay long, just look. Detective Miller didn't wait for a response, the line going dead with a click. It was no longer a comforting blanket, but a fragile shell. The waterfront warehouse. I knew the place. Abandoned for years. A hulking skeleton against the choppy gray sea. And the decomposition being all wrong. That was an impossibility. Time in my field was a constant. A brutal, unforgiving constant. Against my better judgment, I found myself pulling on my old, worn leather jacket. The city's roar, previously a distant hum, now seemed to press in, a clamor of unanswered questions. This was the world I'd run from, and it was calling me back. The car that arrived was unmarked, nondescript. The driver, a young officer with wide, nervous eyes, said nothing as he navigated the city's labyrinthine streets. The air grew heavy with the tang of salt and decay as we approached the waterfront. The warehouse loomed, its corrugated metal walls rusted and peeling, gaping holes like missing teeth. Yellow tape, stark and official, cordoned off the entrance. Detective Miller was waiting for me, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond a single night's work. He was a man who'd seen too much, and tonight he looked like he was seeing something entirely new. Glad you came, User Oj, he replied, his voice low. He gestured towards the warehouse entrance. It's inside, and it's unpleasant. The air inside was thick, stagnant, carrying the cloying sweetness of rot, but it was overlaid with something else, something off, a sterile, almost chemical undertone that didn't belong. My eyes, accustomed to the dim light, scanned the cavernous space. Piles of forgotten crates, cobwebs thick as shrouds, and in the center of it all, a single stark pool of light from a portable generator, and the body. It lay sprawled on the grimy concrete floor, dressed in what looked like expensive, tailored clothing, now ruined. The skin was pale, almost waxy, but it was the state of the body that made my breath catch. It was, too, preserved. For the estimated time of death, there should have been significant putrefaction, a visible progression of insects. But there was nothing. No flies, no maggots, no telltale signs of the natural order at play. It was as if the body had been placed here mere hours ago. I could almost feel the absence of the microbial activity that should have been in full swing. My mind raced, sifting through textbooks, through decades of study, searching for an anomaly, a rare occurrence, anything that could explain this. This defied everything I knew. Then my gaze drifted to the floor just beyond the body's outstretched hand. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration in the grime. A pattern, it looked like a residue. I leaned closer, my heart beginning to thud a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't just a discoloration. It was a fine, powdery dust, barely visible. And it smelled. Faintly metallic and something else I couldn't quite place. Something that tickled the edges of a forgotten memory. What is that? Detective Miller asked, following my gaze. I didn't answer. I was already thinking about the implications, the impossible implications. This wasn't just a murder. This was a statement, a challenge. My carefully constructed isolation was already crumbling. The air in the warehouse was thick with the coppery tang of decay, a smell I knew intimately, yet this was different. This was muted, like a symphony missing its brass section. My gloved fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a deep, unsettling wrongness. I was user OJ, and I dealt with time, with the relentless march of insects and bacteria across the fallen. But here, time seemed to have paused, frozen in a macabre tableau. The detective, a woman with sharp eyes and a weariness that clung to her like cheap cologne, watched me from a respectful distance. "Anything, Mr. User Oj?" he asked, voice low. I finally lowered my hand, the cool air raising gooseflesh on my arms despite the layers of my protective suit. "It's too clean," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "The decomposition is inconsistent. It's like the natural timeline has been, surgically removed." She stepped closer, her gaze flicking from the body to me. "Surgically removed? What does that even mean?" "It means," I answered, pushing myself to my feet, my knees protesting the movement, "that the usual indicators are absent. No significant larval activity, no advanced putrefaction. For the estimated time of death, this body should be much further along, much, much further." I gestured vaguely at the scene. "This isn't just a lack of evidence, it's an active suppression of it." She frowned, a crease deepening between her brows. "We've got nothing. No prints, no DNA, no witnesses. The me is stumped. Says it's like the killer knew exactly how to delay things, but how?" "That," I responded, my voice hardening, "is the question, isn't it?" My mind was already a whirlwind of possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. This wasn't the work of a common criminal. This was someone with a profound understanding of decomposition, someone who could manipulate the very essence of biological time. It felt like a challenge, a twisted game played by someone who understood my own expertise better than I cared to admit. The detective sighed, running a hand through her short, practical haircut. "Look, Mr. User Oj, I'm not going to pretend I understand your bug science, but my superiors are breathing down my neck. We've had 3 like this in as many weeks. All the same, no clear cause of death, no way to pinpoint the timeline. They're calling it the ghost killer." "Ghost killer," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. It was a fitting moniker, given the spectral nature of the crime scenes. "They're saying we need an expert, someone who can read the signs, someone like you. They're willing to pay and pay well. We've got a backlog, a serious backlog. The morgue at capacity after mass casualty event just made things 10 times worse. We've got bodies piling up, and these are priority one. We need answers, Mr. User Oj, and fast." I looked back at the victim, at the unnerving stillness of the scene. A part of me, the part that craved the quiet solitude of my research, screamed to turn and walk away. My life was in my lab, surrounded by the silent, predictable narratives of death. This was chaos, a perversion of the natural order. But another part, the part that had been awakened by this impossible puzzle, felt a morbid curiosity, a pull towards the unknown. The sheer audacity of it, the intellectual arrogance of a killer who could defy the very laws of nature I studied, was both horrifying and, in a twisted way, compelling. "I don't consult," I stated, my voice flat. "My work is my own." The detective's sharp eyes narrowed, a flicker of something that might have been desperation crossing her face. "This isn't just about bugs, mister. This is about a killer who's playing God with time. If they can do this, what's next? And if you're the best at understanding how life decays, then you're the only one who can help us understand how this one was. Undecayed." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Undecayed. It was a concept that shouldn't exist. Yet here I was, standing in a warehouse, staring at a body that defied it. I thought of my secluded life, the years I'd spent burying myself in my work, trying to outrun other things. This was a different kind of darkness, a manufactured one, and it was spreading. "Who is the medical examiner on this case?" I asked, the words escaping before I could stop them. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the detective's lips. "Dr. Aris, he's been working overtime. He's at the precinct now, going over the preliminary findings. He's intrigued." Intrigued, I knew that feeling. It was the siren song of a good mystery, a melody that could lure even the most reclusive soul out of their shell. I took a deep breath, the scent of decay no longer just a smell, but a question mark hanging in the air. "Fine," I added, the word feeling alien on my tongue. "I'll come, but I work on my own terms, and I expect full access to everything." The detective nodded, a flicker of relief in her eyes. "Understood. My name is Detective Thorne. I'll have a car waiting for you." She paused, then added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "And Mr. User Oj, be careful, this killer. They're not just good. They're—" I could already feel the familiar weight of my old research papers being replaced by something far heavier, far more dangerous. The ghost killer. The air in the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event was thick with the metallic tang of decay and something else. A sterile, chemical sharpness that couldn't quite mask the underlying rot. It was a smell I knew intimately, a scent that had permeated my life for decades, yet this place was different. Overwhelmed, bodies were stacked, shrouded in pale sheets, a grim testament to whatever had emptied the city's streets. The usual quiet hum of refrigeration units was a strained thrum against the hushed, hurried movements of the personnel. "User Oj," a voice rasped from behind a rolling cart laden with equipment. The detective, a man whose perpetual frown seemed etched into his features, gestured me over. His eyes, dark and weary, held a flicker of something I recognized as desperation. Glad I could make it, we're swamped. I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the scene. The victim lay on a stainless steel table, the sheet pulled back just enough to reveal the unnervingly pristine state of the body. No signs of struggle, no obvious wounds. Just a stillness that felt wrong, too perfect. The pathologist, a woman with her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin, was already at work, her movements precise and efficient despite the chaos surrounding us. "Anything new?" I inquired, my voice low, careful not to disturb the already frayed nerves. The detective sighed, running a hand over his stubbled chin. "That's why I re here. No cause of death, no defensive wounds, nothing, it's like he just decided to stop living. And the timing, that's what's killing us." He lowered his voice. "The first one we figured maybe 2-3 days. This one, it's been less than 24 hours and it looks almost the same age as the first. It's impossible, User Oj, utterly impossible." Impossible. That word echoed in my mind, a familiar, unwelcome guest. My fingers, already gloved, reached for my collection kit. I bypassed the tools the pathologist was using, opting for my own specialized brushes and vials. The real story for me wasn't in the surface wounds or the lack thereof. It was in the microscopic, the teeming, the inevitable bloom of life that followed death. I leaned in, my magnifying glass hovering over the exposed skin. The air, despite the chill, felt heavy with potential. I searched for the earliest signs, the infinitesimal tracks of life that defied the sterile environment. My breath hitched. There. On the edge of the eyelid, barely visible to the naked eye, a minuscule cluster, not the usual sarcophagids, not yet. These were smaller, more delicate. "What do I see?" the detective pressed, his voice a low growl of impatience. "Early colonizers," I murmured, carefully collecting a sample. "Something very specific, very sensitive to temperature and humidity, not what I'd expect on a body this fresh." I moved to another area, my eyes scanning for any deviation from the expected pattern. The body was a canvas and the insects were the brush strokes, each species painting a picture of the timeline. But here the paint was smudged, strokes deliberately obscured. I worked methodically, my mind a whirlwind of hypotheses and counter-hypotheses. There was the killer manipulating the environment, introducing specific agents. This wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about a violation of natural law, a perversion of the very cycles I had dedicated my life to understanding. I bagged them carefully, my hands steady, my mind already racing ahead to the analysis. Back in my own makeshift, the familiar scent of ethanol and preserved specimens was a strange comfort. I set up my microscope, the hum of the equipment a counterpoint to the distant wail of sirens. The first sample was under the lens. Tiny, pale, almost translucent, not blowfly larvae, not houseflies. These were something else, something I'd only encountered in obscure texts, species known for their ability to thrive in very specific, often challenging microclimates. And their presence here, on a body that should have been untouched by them, was a glaring anomaly. My fingers flew across my keyboard, cross-referencing with my extensive database. The implications began to solidify, forming a disturbing picture. These insects were typically found in damp, shaded environments, often associated with fungal growth. They were not opportunistic scavengers in the way flies were. They were selective. A sudden, jarring ring from my personal phone shattered the quiet. It was the detective. His voice was strained, tight with a controlled panic. "User Oj, another one, just found, same impossible timeline, same lack of evidence, and this one's in a public park, wide open, how the hell?" I didn't need to ask, the park, open air, the very opposite of the damp, shaded microclimate my samples suggested. It didn't add up, not at all. It was starting to feel like a premonition. This wasn't just a killer playing games. This was someone with an unnerving understanding of decomposition, someone who could bend the natural order to their will. And the ghost, as the detective had called the killer, was just getting started. The weight I'd felt earlier, the one that had settled over me as I left the first scene, was now a crushing burden. The game was on, and the clock, for the victims, was ticking backward. The air in the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event was thick, not just with the usual sterile scent of disinfectant, but with a palpable sense of dread. The sheer volume of bodies, even behind the closed doors, pressed in. I could practically feel the weight of it, a grim monument to whatever catastrophe had befallen the city. My colleague, the lead detective, met me by the entrance, his face etched with exhaustion that went beyond a long night. "User Oj," he said, his voice rough. "Thanks for coming, it's a mess." I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the rows of stainless steel drawers, each one a silent testament to a life abruptly ended. The initial reports were sparse. What can I tell me? He led me into a sterile viewing room away from the immediate press of the deceased. A single, stark overhead light illuminated the space. On a metal table lay a thick file, its contents spread out. Photographs, lab reports, a preliminary timeline that felt more like speculation than fact. "Victim 2, he began, tapping a photo of a young woman, her eyes wide and vacant. "Sarah Jenkins. He was found in her apartment, no forced entry, no signs of struggle." I picked up a magnifying glass, examining the details of the crime scene photos. The room was meticulously tidy, almost unnervingly so. Everything in its place except for the stillness of Sarah Jenkins. I scanned the accompanying notes. Time of death estimates were wildly inconsistent, bouncing between 24 and 72 hours. It was the same frustrating ambiguity as the first victim. "And victim 3? I asked, my fingers tracing the edge of a detail shot showing a faint discoloration on the victim's forearm. "Mark Davison, local librarian. He was discovered by his neighbor." "Same story," the detective sighed, pushing a photograph of a middle-aged man towards me. "The me is pulling their hair out. They can't reconcile the stages of decomposition. It's like time itself is playing tricks." That's exactly what I'd been thinking. Time was the killer's weapon, or at least his accomplice, but how? I leaned closer to the photos of Mark Davison, my gaze drawn to a small, almost imperceptible smudge on the wooden floorboards near the body. It looked like dried mud, but the apartment was on the 5th floor. "Did the initial sweep find any trace evidence?" I asked, my voice low. The detective shook his head. "Clean, almost too clean. It's like the killer wore a hazmat suit, then vaporized." He paused, then added, "There's a pushback from some of my guys. They think you're chasing ghosts, User Oj, that this is beyond our scope." I understood. The inexplicable nature of these deaths would breed skepticism. But the inconsistencies in the decomposition were too deliberate, too precise to be random. It spoke of a profound understanding of decay, a knowledge that mirrored my own. "What about their lives?" I pressed, pushing the photos of Sarah Jenkins back towards the detective. "Did they know each other? Any overlap?" He flipped through a few pages. "That's where it gets weird. Sarah Jenkins worked part-time at a community garden. Mark Davison, librarian, but also a volunteer at the city's historical society. They both frequented the same small coffee shop downtown. Nothing substantial, just proximity. Proximity, not a strong link, but in cases like these, every thread mattered. I requested access to their personal effects, anything that might offer a clue to their routines, their associations." The detective hesitated. "Look, User Oj, I'm giving you a lot of leeway here. My superiors are breathing down my neck. They want answers, not fly-by-night theories." "This isn't about theories," I countered, meeting his gaze. "It's about evidence. And the evidence is screaming that something is fundamentally wrong with how we're perceiving time in these cases. I need to see their belongings." He finally relented, handing me a set of keys. "Just be discreet, and don't go stirring up more trouble than you already have." As I left the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event, the weight of the city's grief felt heavier. The inconsistencies in the decomposition weren't just scientific puzzles. They were a deliberate taunt. And the resistance from within the department. That suggested someone with influence wanted these cases to remain unsolved. A shadowy organization, perhaps, or an individual with a vested interest in keeping their methods hidden. The mud smudge, the tidy apartments, the impossible timelines, they were all pieces of a much larger and far more disturbing picture. I had a feeling I was stepping into something far more complex than a simple murder investigation. This was about control, about manipulating the very fabric of what we understand as time and decay. The air in the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event was thick, a cloying blend of disinfectant and something far more visceral. Each toe tag felt like a personal accusation. I'd seen death in all its messy, predictable forms for decades, but this was different. The usual timeline, the slow, inevitable march of decay, was being warped. It was like watching a clock run backward, or worse, stand still. My colleague, the detective, stood by the stainless steel table, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored my own. He gestured towards the latest arrival, a woman whose body had been discovered in a disused warehouse on the docks. "Anything, user Oj?" I knelt, the chill of the floor seeping through my trousers. The standard flies and beetles were present, of course, but their numbers and developmental stages were all wrong. For a body that had been exposed for at least 3 days, judging by the initial reports, the larval stages were too young, the adult flies too scarce. It was as if the insects had been deliberately held back or perhaps introduced at precisely the wrong time. "It's a performance," I murmured, more to myself than to the detective. I carefully collected a sample of larvae, placing them in a sterile vial. "A staged scene. Someone is playing with time." The detective sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Playing with time? User Oj, we need facts, hard evidence, not theatrical interpretations." "Theatrical interpretations are often rooted in very hard facts," I countered, my gaze sweeping over the room. The sheer volume of bodies pressed in, each one a silent testament to the killer's ruthlessness. But it was the subtle inconsistencies that truly gnawed at me. The lack of disturbance in the surrounding dust, the odd placement of a single, perfectly preserved bloom near the victim's hand. These weren't random acts, they were intentional. Back in my lab, a cramped space overflowing with specimens and specialized equipment, I meticulously examined the larvae under the microscope. The species was common, Lucilia sericata, the common green bottle fly, nothing out of the ordinary there. But then I noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible coating on the exoskeletons of the youngest larvae. It wasn't natural. I scraped a tiny sample onto a slide. Under higher magnification, it resolved into a complex organic compound, something that would inhibit insect development, but only temporarily. A controlled delay. "So that's how," I whispered, a chill tracing its way down my spine. It wasn't just knowledge of insects. It was knowledge of chemistry, of applied science used for the most gruesome of purposes. This wasn't some amateur dabbling in decomposition. This was a calculated, sophisticated manipulation. The implications sent a jolt through me. Whoever was doing this understood the very science that defined my life's work. They knew how to slow the clock, how to misdirect the forensic entomologist. And they were doing it to cover their tracks, to make the investigation impossible. I spent the next few hours cross-referencing my findings with historical cases, searching for any precedent, any hint of this method. Nothing. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking, an encrypted message. My fingers, usually steady, trembled slightly as I typed in the decryption key. It was a simple text file, no sender information. "User Oj." My breath hitched. How did they know my name? I was a recluse, a ghost in my own field, rarely interacting with anyone outside of my research. "I am closer than I think. The flies tell a story, don't they? You understand the science, User Oj, you understand the cycle, but you don't understand the disruption. The true art is not in the decay, but in the defiance of it. You see the insects, but you miss the hand that guides them." My mind raced. This wasn't just a taunt, it was a direct challenge. They knew I was onto something. They were watching me. "That bloom you found? A narcissus. A symbol of vanity. Fitting, wouldn't you say? She thought he was beautiful, the narcissus." I dismissed it as a macabre flourish, a personal touch from the killer, but it was more than that. It was a message, and I was apparently the intended recipient. "Don't worry, User Oj, there will be more flowers. This killer wasn't just a phantom of decomposition. They were a phantom who knew me, who was deliberately engaging me. The investigation had just moved from the abstract to the terrifyingly personal. I wasn't just solving a case. I was being drawn into a game, and the stakes were my own life. The silence in my lab after that message was a physical thing, pressing in on my eardrums. It wasn't just the usual hum of the incubators or the faint scent of formaldehyde that usually filled my space. This silence was pregnant with implication, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event. I could still feel the phantom chill of that place, the sterile, metallic tang of death clinging to my clothes, my skin. The killer hadn't just taunted me. They'd twisted the knife, reminding me of the one time I'd been overwhelmed, the one time the sheer volume of loss had threatened to drown me. My fingers, usually steady when picking through the minutiae of insect life, trembled as I reached for the discarded tablet. The message was gone, wiped clean as if it had never been. "You understand time, User Oj, but you've never seen it truly warped." Warped? What did that even mean? My work was about the predictable march of decay, the reliable signs of life and death etched in the bodies of insects. It was science, not some kind of macabre art. A knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't just about the murders anymore. This was about me. The killer knew my name, knew my expertise, and seemed to know more. That thought, the implication of a deeper, more sinister knowledge, sent a shiver down my spine, a sensation entirely alien to me. I was the one who dealt with the tangible, the observable. Ghosts and premonitions were not part of my vocabulary. I pushed away from my desk, the polished wood cool beneath my forearms. I needed to move, to do something other than replay the cryptic message. My gaze fell on a framed photograph on the shelf, a younger me, smiling, surrounded by a group of equally bright-eyed individuals. We were at a conference years ago celebrating the completion of a groundbreaking research project. The project had been my life's work then, a deep dive into the accelerated decomposition of. Well, it was sensitive, proprietary. Could this killer be connected to that? My mind raced, sifting through faded memories. The project had been intense, collaborative, and ultimately fraught with its own set of pressures. We'd been a tight-knit group, fueled by ambition and a shared obsession with the ephemeral nature of life, but people drift. Ambitions curdle, and sometimes resentments fester. I walked over to a locked filing cabinet, the metallic click of the tumblers sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet lab. Inside, among the meticulously organized case files and research papers, were the records from that long-ago project. I pulled out a thick binder, its cover faded, the title barely legible. Project Chronos Temporal Decomposition Studies. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt entirely out of sync with my usual measured calm. Flipping through the brittle pages, I scanned the list of participants. Dr. Anya Sharma, my brilliant co-lead, whose sharp intellect was matched only by her fierce ambition. Mark Jenkins, the quiet biologist, always hunched over his Petri dishes, his dedication bordering on obsessive. And then there was Elias Thorne. The name sent a jolt of unease through me. Elias had been brilliant, charismatic, but unstable. He'd been the one most fascinated by the unorthodox applications of our research. He'd pushed boundaries, sometimes crossing them, and eventually, he'd been asked to leave the project. We hadn't heard from him in years. The killer's message had mentioned warping time. Project Chronos had been all about accelerating decomposition, about manipulating the very passage of time on a biological level. It wasn't a stretch to imagine someone with that kind of knowledge, that kind of twisted perspective, using it for something far more sinister. I pulled out another file, this one more recent, detailing the initial findings from the first few victims. The lack of conventional dating evidence, the peculiar state of insect activity, or rather the lack of it at specific stages, it all fit. It was too precise, too deliberate to be random. This wasn't just a killer, it was someone who understood the science, someone who could manipulate the forensic timeline, someone like Elias Thorne. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. I needed to contact the others. Sharma, Jenkins, we had to talk. We had to figure out if one of us or someone we knew had turned our shared past into a weapon. The weight of that possibility settled on me, a burden heavier than any case file. The morgue at capacity after mass casualty event had been a nightmare of overwhelming numbers. This felt infinitely worse. A nightmare distilled to a single, terrifying point of origin, and I was at the center of it. The message from the anonymous informant sat on my desk, stark white against the dark wood. They're using the old bioresearch facility on the industrial outskirts. Sector Gamma, look for the ventilation shaft marked with a faded red star. It was so cryptic, so convenient, almost too convenient, but the urgency in the last few words before they move him had clawed its way through my carefully constructed apathy. Detective Sharma met me at the rendezvous point, a grimy diner on the edge of the city's industrial sprawl. The air here tasted of rust and stale oil. He looked as weary as I felt, him usual sharp gaze dulled by sleepless nights and a growing frustration. "You think this is it, user Aj?" he questioned, stirring him lukewarm coffee with a plastic spoon. "It's the only lead we have, detective," I replied, my voice rougher than I intended. The thought of the morgue at capacity after mass casualty events still clung to me, a grim reminder of the scale of what we were up against. The bodies there, each a puzzle, each whispering its secrets of time and decay, were a testament to a killer who understood something fundamental about life and death that eluded most. And now this. We drove in her unmarked sedan, the city lights receding behind us, replaced by the skeletal silhouettes of warehouses and abandoned factories. The old bioresearch facility was less a building and more a concrete scar on the landscape. It loomed, a hulking, windowless monolith against the bruised twilight sky. A faded red star, barely visible in the dim light, was indeed painted on a rusting ventilation shaft near the rear of the structure. It looked like a forgotten marker, a forgotten promise of something scientific, something potentially terrible. The air inside the facility was thick with the smell of mildew and something else. Something metallic and vaguely medicinal. Dust motes danced in the light, the only sign of movement in the stagnant air. "This place gives me the creeps," Detective Sharma murmured, her hand resting on the holster at her hip. "It was shut down decades ago," I answered, unofficially. I trailed off. We moved deeper into the facility, our footsteps echoing unnervingly. My specialized kit, usually so familiar, felt cumbersome and inadequate in this environment. I was used to the controlled chaos of the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event, where death had a certain order. This felt different, a deliberate perversion of that order. We found a section that seemed more intact, a series of interconnected rooms. One room in particular drew my attention. It was a large chamber dominated by what looked like a reinforced containment unit. My flashlight beam swept across the floor and I froze. I knelt down, my gloved fingers carefully collecting a few. Under my pocket magnifier, they resolved into brittle, desiccated pieces of what looked like human fingernails, not freshly broken, but old, dried out, brittle with age. "What is it?" Detective Sharma asked, her voice low. "Evidence of something old," I replied, my mind racing. "But not as old as this place, and not related to the killer's usual timeline. These are preserved." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Someone had been here deliberately collecting and storing these remnants. We moved to the next room. It was smaller, more like an office. A desk, a chair, and a filing cabinet. The cabinet drawers were surprisingly easy to open, as if someone had recently used them. Inside, files. Not official reports, but handwritten journals filled with cramped, almost illegible script. I picked one up, the brittle pages crackling. The dates were inconsistent, jumping years, even decades. But the content was disturbing. Detailed accounts of experiments of subjects, of attempts to manipulate decomposition, to accelerate it, to arrest it, to control it. "This is horrifying," Detective Sharma breathed, peering over my shoulder. They were trying to control decomposition, then my flashlight beam caught something else. Tucked beneath the desk, almost out of sight, was a small, tarnished silver locket. I picked it up. With trembling fingers, I pried it open. Inside, faded photographs, a woman, a man, and a child. The child's face was blurred, but the eyes seemed to hold a profound sadness, and then I saw it. Scratched faintly into the inside of the locket, barely visible, a single faded red star. My breath hitched. The same star as the ventilation shaft. The same star as the informant's message. This wasn't just about the killer anymore. This facility, these experiments, they were connected. And the locket, it felt like a message, a warning or a plea. Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed from the other side of the facility, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. We weren't alone. We had stumbled into something far more complex and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The air in the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event hung thick, a cloying perfume of formaldehyde and something else, something metallic and earthy that always clung to places where life had so abruptly ceased. It was a smell I knew intimately, one that usually brought a grim sense of order to the chaos of death. But tonight, it felt like a shroud. My flashlight beam still danced over the tarnished silver locket, its surface dulled by time and neglect. It was so small, so out of place amidst the sterile steel and the silent forms laid out on slabs. "Anything, user Oj?" The detective's voice was a low rumble cutting through the hushed stillness. He stood a few feet away, his shadow stretching long and distorted on the tiled floor. I picked up the locket with a gloved hand, turning it over. No inscription, no distinguishing marks. It felt cold against my palm. "Just this. Doesn't seem like our killer's usual calling card." I set it down on a nearby counter, the slight clang echoing unnervingly. The usual markers were absent, as always. No fibers, no prints, no DNA that wasn't already part of the victim's story. The only clues were the insects, and even they were a riddle. I'd spent the last 48 hours hunched over my microscope, the city's relentless hum a distant counterpoint to the frantic buzz of my own thoughts. The entomological evidence from the latest victim, found in the abandoned warehouse down by the docks, was wrong, not just subtly off, but fundamentally, impossibly wrong. The blowfly eggs, for instance, they were too few, too underdeveloped for the time the body had supposedly been there. And the larval development, the maggots, they were anachronistic, suggesting a much earlier infestation than the timeline allowed. It was like trying to read a clock with hands that spun backward. "You're quiet," the detective observed, his gaze sharp. He knew I was wrestling with something. He always did. "The timing," I finally said, my voice a low rasp. "It's the timing. The insects are out of sync. It's like they've been manipulated." He frowned, leaning in. "Manipulated? How?" I gestured vaguely, frustration gnawing at me. I don't know, some kind of environmental control, accelerated growth. I've seen it in the lab with controlled conditions, but not like this. Not in the field. Not without leaving a trace. My mind raced, sifting through decades of research of obscure papers and forgotten theories. This wasn't just about a killer who understood decomposition. This was about a killer who could control it. The implications were enormous. If the killer could manipulate the insect life cycle, they could effectively erase the timeline of the crime, making it impossible to date. They could create a forensic phantom, a ghost that left no temporal footprint, and that meant they could operate with impunity, striking again and again without ever being truly caught. Who would even have the means for something like that? The detective mused, echoing my own unspoken fear. Someone with resources, someone with knowledge, I replied, my gaze drifting back to the victim on the slab. The vacant stare, the stillness, it all felt like a deliberate performance, a stage set for my own unraveling. Then a memory, sharp and unwelcome, sliced through the fog of my thoughts. A name, a place, a face I hadn't seen in years, the locket, it was too coincidental. The victims, the methods, and now a small, tarnished trinket that felt like a taunt. I remembered a similar locket, a gift to someone I had tried to protect, someone who had been caught in the crossfire of my past. The next victim, I responded, the words tumbling out before I could fully process them. It won't be random. It'll be personal. The organization. They were the only ones with the motive and the capability to orchestrate something this elaborate, this cruel. They wanted to break me, to show me that my expertise, my life's work, was nothing against their power. And they knew my weaknesses. They're telling me they know. They're telling me who's next. My gaze snapped up to meet the detectives. It's someone from my past, someone I haven't seen in years, but someone they know I still care about. And if they are manipulating the insects, they're not just trying to hide the crime. They're trying to send a message to me. The tension in the room ratcheted up a palpable force. I had to move, and fast. The clock was ticking, not just on this case, but on a life. My life and someone else's. The air in the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event was thick with the metallic tang of decay, a smell I knew too well. It coated the back of my throat, a constant reminder of what I did, of what I was about to do. My gaze swept over the rows of sheet-draped forms, each a silent testament to a life cut short. The sheer volume of them was staggering, a brutal testament to the chaos outside. But amidst this grim tableau, a single detail gnawed at me, a discordant note in the symphony of death. I'd been here for hours, poring over the preliminary reports, my fingers tracing the typed words as if they held a physical secret. The official narrative was clear, a swift, brutal attack, no witnesses, minimal evidence. But the timeline, that was the ghost. The estimated time of death for the victims, especially the third one, felt off. It was too clean, too precise, like a carefully curated exhibit. And that's what worried me. A killer who understood time, who could manipulate the very markers we used to reconstruct the past, was a dangerous kind of monster. A sharp rap on the reinforced door jolted me. My hand instinctively went to the small, familiar weight of the forensic kit I carried. The detective stood silhouetted against the dim hallway light, his face etched with fatigue. "User Oj, I still hear anything?" I met his tired gaze, the question hanging heavy between us. "Something's not right," I said, my voice a low rumble. The third victim, the rigor mortis, the lividity. It doesn't match the reported time of death. It's like the body was aged. He frowned, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Aged, what are I saying? Time travel. I allowed a ghost of a smile, though it didn't reach my eyes. Not quite, but someone is very good at controlling the narrative, or the bodies. I gestured towards a particularly pristine specimen, its outline sharp beneath the sheet. Look at this. The decomposition patterns are too uniform for the stated interval. It's almost staged. The detective approached, his skepticism warring with the desperate hope for a breakthrough. He pulled back the sheet, revealing the stark, pale features of the victim. He grunted, a sound of distaste. "Looks like a body to me, User Oj, a dead one." "Precisely," I countered, my mind racing. "But how dead and when?" The killer isn't just taking lives, they're playing with time. They're leaving us a puzzle, but one with deliberately misplaced pieces. I remembered the strange, almost crystalline residue found on the killer's previous victims, something that had defied immediate analysis. It wasn't blood, wasn't fibers, it was something else. Something that accelerated or perhaps even mimicked the processes of decay. "So what do I think? A new kind of poison? Some chemical trick?" the detective asked, his voice low. "Possibly," I admitted, though a colder, more unwelcome suspicion was starting to take root. This felt less like a chemical attack and more like a deliberate manipulation of natural processes. It was the kind of knowledge that came from a deep, almost obsessive understanding of my own field, but twisted, perverted. But I need to see the scene of the third murder, the original site. That's where the real clues are. He hesitated, the weight of protocol pressing down on him. It's sealed off. Too dangerous. More dangerous than letting this killer continue? I challenged, my voice hardening. The reclusive shell I'd built around myself was cracking, revealing the determined, almost obsessive man beneath. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was a confrontation. A tense silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the hum of the refrigeration units. Finally, the detective sighed, a sound of resignation. All right, but I go with us. No solo excursions. The abandoned factory loomed before us, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. The air here was different, heavy with the scent of dust, damp concrete, and something else. Something faintly sweet and cloying like overripe fruit. This was it. The third scene, the one that had gnawed at me. We moved through the cavernous space, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The detectives' team worked methodically, dusting for prints, marking evidence. I, however, was drawn to a specific corner, a patch of discolored concrete, a faint stain that the preliminary sweep might have overlooked. And then I saw it. Tucked beneath a rusted metal beam, almost invisible in the shadows, was a small, dark vial. It was empty, but a faint, viscous residue coated its inner surface. It was the same crystalline substance from the other victims. My stomach clenched. This was the key. This was how the killer was manipulating time. Suddenly, a voice, smooth as polished obsidian, echoed from the rafters above. Impressive, User Odge, you always did have a keen eye for the details others missed. My head snapped up. The killer, who are you? I demanded, my hand tightening around the vial. A curator, the voice replied, a hint of amusement lacing the words. Of moments, of endings. This wasn't just a killer with a unique method. This was someone who understood my work, who had studied it, perhaps even stolen from it. The vial in my hand felt suddenly very heavy. The game had just escalated, and the rules were about to be rewritten in blood and dust. The air in the warehouse hung thick and still, a cloying mix of stale oil and something metallic, something I'd come to associate with the aftermath of violence. My gloved hands still trembled slightly, the phantom weight of that vial a constant pressure against my palm. The confrontation had been brief, brutal, and left me with more questions than answers. I'd seen the stranger's face, a fleeting glimpse in the flickering emergency lights, and it was a face I couldn't quite place, yet it felt unnervingly familiar. The wail of approaching sirens sliced through the quiet, a welcome sound that also tightened my chest. The police. They'd be here soon, swarming the scene, and I'd have to explain. Explain what, exactly? That I'd stumbled upon a killer who was using insects not just as a tool, but as a message. That this killer knew my research, my methodology, perhaps even my deepest fears. I looked down at the vial I'd managed to snatch from the stranger. It was small, dark glass, sealed tightly. Inside, a few specks of something dark and granular. It wasn't what I expected. I'd anticipated something biological, something connected to the unique decomposition patterns I'd been observing, but this felt different. The warehouse doors burst open, flooding the space with harsh white light and the urgent shouts of uniformed officers. I raised my hands, a gesture of surrender that felt ridiculous given the circumstances. The detective, the one with the perpetually weary eyes, pushed through the cordon of his officers, his gaze fixing on me. User Odge, what in God's name are you doing here? His voice was rough, strained. I followed a lead. I managed my voice hoarse. The killer, I think I saw him. He scowled, eyes sweeping over the scene. The scattered tools, the overturned crates, the faint, almost imperceptible dusting of something that looked like fine sand on the concrete floor. Saw him, and you decided to play detective. He was here, I insisted, holding up the vial. He left this. The detective took the vial, his fingers gloved. He held it up to the light, his brow furrowed. What is it? I don't know yet, I admitted. But it's important. He knows about my work. Detective, he's using it. His expression shifted, a flicker of something akin to understanding or perhaps just deeper suspicion. Your work, you're talking about the flies, the time of death. We've been over this. The MES are stumped. The bodies are. They're not aging correctly. Exactly, I said, the tension in my chest ratcheting up another notch. And that's because he's manipulating the decomposition. This vial, I think it's how he's doing it, signaled to one of his forensics team. Bag this. Get it to the lab, stat. Priority 1, User Odge, you're coming with me. The drive to the precinct was silent, punctuated only by the crackle of the police radio. My mind raced, replaying the encounter in the warehouse. He hadn't been panicked. He'd been deliberate, and the way he'd spoken my name, like a threat and a promise all at once. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was a beehive of controlled chaos. The news of a potential breakthrough, however small, had rippled through the ranks. The detective sat across from me, his notepad open. "Tell me everything," he commanded. I recounted the events of the past hour, the anonymous tip, the warehouse, the confrontation. I described the stranger, the vial, my growing suspicion that this was no random act of violence. The detective's questions weren't just about the immediate crime scene. He was probing my past, my research, my associations. "You mentioned he knew your work," he pressed. "How? Who else has access to your research, user Odge? Anyone you've collaborated with? Anyone you've fallen out with?" I hesitated. My work was my life, a solitary pursuit. "There are entities," I finally admitted, choosing my words carefully. "Groups who see forensic entomology as more than just science. They see it as a weapon." The detective's pen paused. He looked at me, his weary eyes sharp now. "Entities, you mean like the government? Or? They've been observing me for years, trying to recruit me. I've always refused." A grim understanding dawned on his face. "So this isn't just a killer, this is a message." The vial in my hand, the grains inside, the stranger's face, it was all starting to connect, forming a picture far more terrifying than I could have imagined. The killer wasn't just playing games with time and decomposition. He was playing games with me, and whoever he worked for, they were making a statement. The next few days were a blur. The forensics team confirmed the granular substance in the vial was a unique engineered compound, a catalyst that drastically accelerated insect activity and, consequently, decomposition. The implications were immense. The killer wasn't just skilled. He was technologically advanced, with access to resources I couldn't even fathom. The city was abuzz with the news of the accelerated decomposition killer, but the official narrative was carefully controlled. The police were tight-lipped, and I was under a sort of informal surveillance, my apartment a constant reminder of the danger I was in. My isolation, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. Then came the call, not from the detective, but from an unknown number. My heart hammered a rhythm against my ribs that felt entirely too loud in the quiet of my apartment. I hesitated, then answered. "User Odge," a low, disembodied voice said, devoid of emotion. "You've made a mistake, you interfered." My breath hitched. Someone who understands the value of time, and someone who knows you're about to face a decision, the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event. A grim sight, isn't it? But imagine what could happen if that capacity was pushed even further. We can help you, or we can stop you. The choice, as always, is yours. The line went dead, the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event. The words echoed in my mind, a grim premonition. They weren't just threatening me anymore, they were threatening the city. And the full scope of their plan, whatever it was only just beginning to unravel. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a hollow, empty sound. I lowered the receiver slowly, the plastic cool against my clammy palm. "Morgue at capacity after mass casualty event." The words delivered in that clipped, synthesized voice were a chilling promise. It wasn't just a threat against me anymore. It was a declaration of war on the city. They were escalating, and my carefully constructed isolation, my sanctuary of specimens and silent observation, felt as fragile as a house of cards in a hurricane. I stared at the phone, my reflection a gaunt, unfamiliar face in the polished black surface. For so long, I'd buried myself in the microscopic world of insects, finding solace in the predictable cycles of life and death. But this was chaos. A soft knock at my study door startled me. I hadn't heard anyone approach. My hand instinctively went to the heavy, antique letter opener on my desk. "User Odge." It was Detective Sharma's voice, calm and steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside me. I took a deep breath, forcing my shoulders to relax. I couldn't afford to be skittish, not now. "Come in, Detective." She entered, her presence filling the room without overwhelming it. Her gaze swept over the cluttered shelves, the glass vials, the meticulously organized drawers. She didn't flinch at the preserved specimens or the diagrams of blowfly life cycles pinned to the corkboard. Her eyes, however, held a new intensity, a shared weariness that spoke volumes. "I got my message," she added, her voice low, "about the anonymous call." I nodded, gesturing to the chair opposite my desk. It wasn't a prank, Detective, it was a warning. I needed her to trust my instincts, not just my evidence. She sat, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. "The morgue at capacity after mass casualty event, that's a lot of bodies. It means they're planning something big." I answered, my own voice regaining some of its usual measured tone. "Something that will overwhelm the system, and they want us to know it." Detective Sharma leaned forward, him elbows on him knees. "This killer, User Odge. You've always been the one to tell us how long a body has been dead, how long the flies have been at work, but with these last few, It's like they're playing games with time. We can't get a solid estimate. It's like the decomposition is stalled. Not stalled, detective. I corrected, the familiar spark of intellectual curiosity momentarily overriding the fear. Manipulated. They're not just killing people, they're distorting the forensic timeline, and that requires a very specific, very disturbing kind of knowledge. My gaze drifted to a jar on a high shelf. She stated, not a question. I think they know of my work, I corrected, a knot tightening in my stomach. Or, more accurately, they know the potential of forensic entomology. They're using that knowledge to create a smokescreen to make their victims impossible to place in time. And that makes them and their motives impossible to understand. He was silent for a moment, processing. The tension in the room was palpable, a tight wire stretched between us. It wasn't the fear of the unknown anymore, but the shared weight of a growing threat. We've been running background checks, looking for anyone with a deep understanding of decomposition, anyone who might have access to specialized knowledge, she admitted. Nothing, it's like they're a ghost. Ghosts leave traces, detective, I responded, my eyes meeting hers. Just not always the ones we expect. The insects, they don't lie, they tell a story even when the killer tries to scrub it clean. But this killer, they're not just trying to scrub it clean, they're actively rewriting it. I stood and walked to a large anatomical chart of a human body pointing to different areas. The location of the body, the type of insects found, their life stage, it all paints a picture. But if the killer understands that, they can introduce elements that throw the timeline off. They can contaminate the scene with insects from a different stage of development or even plant them. It's a sophisticated deception. Detective Sharma stood, walking over to the chart. He traced a finger along the diagram of the abdomen. So what do we do, user Oj? If we can't trust the clock, how do we catch them? I looked at her, a flicker of something akin to hope in my chest. It was the first time in a long time I'd felt a connection to the outside world, a shared purpose. My isolation had been a shield, but it had also been a prison. We look at what doesn't fit. The killer wants us to chase the obvious, the easily manipulated timeline. But the truth, detective, is always in the details, and the insects. They're still talking. We just have to learn to listen to a different language. I turned back to my desk, my eyes falling on the phone. The anonymous call had been a wake-up call, a brutal shove out of my self-imposed exile. The threat to the morgue, to the city, was real. And for the first time in years, I felt the pull of responsibility, the obligation to use my knowledge, my peculiar understanding of death's silent witnesses, to bring this perpetrator to justice. The reclusive entomologist was stepping back into the light, however, dimly, and the hunt was on. The fluorescent lights of the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event hummed a discordant symphony, a stark contrast to the usual quiet hum of my lab. The air, thick with the scent of disinfectant and something far less pleasant, clung to my clothes, a constant reminder of the chaos outside. I ran a hand over my tired eyes, the anonymous call still echoing in my mind. This wasn't just about a killer anymore. It was about a deliberate perversion of the natural order, a mockery of the very science that had consumed my life. I walked through the rows, the bodies laid out like morbid specimens. Each one represented a life cut short, a story abruptly ended. But these weren't just victims, they were pieces of a puzzle. Their decomposition rates twisted and manipulated to create an illusion. It was a game of deception played out on the most intimate stage, the human body. My gaze fell upon a particular table, the one the anonymous caller had hinted at. The body was that of the last victim, the one that had truly sent shivers down my spine. The detective had been baffled, the usual markers of time obscured, but I knew. I'd seen the subtle signs, the almost imperceptible shifts in the insect activity, or rather, the lack of it. Someone had been very careful, very deliberate in their staging. I knelt, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. The skin was cool, the rigidity still present, but not in the way it should have been. It was too uniform, too preserved. I opened my magnifying glass, my heart thrumming a steady, focused rhythm against my ribs. There, almost invisible against the pallor of the skin, were the telltale signs. Not the vibrant, teeming life I usually sought, but the subtle remnants of a staged scene. Tiny, almost microscopic fragments of a specific type of resin used to inhibit insect colonization. And the faint, chemical scent masked by the disinfectant, a ghost of the accelerant used to speed up certain stages of decomposition while slowing others. It was a masterpiece of forensic sabotage. The killer wasn't just smart. They were a scientist, or at least someone with a profound understanding of the very principles I dedicated my life to. And they were using that knowledge to commit murder. I stood up, a grim determination settling over me. The anonymous call, the threats, the sheer audacity of the crimes, it all pointed to something larger, something more sinister than a lone psychopath. The organization, the one whispered about in hushed tones within certain scientific circles, the one that dealt in forbidden knowledge, in manipulating the very fabric of life and death. They were involved. This wasn't just about a few murders, it was about control, about proving their power. A movement at the doorway caught my eye. The detective stood there, his face a mask of exhaustion and frustration. He'd been following my progress, a silent observer in my world of decay and rebirth. "Anything, user Oj?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I met his gaze, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I know how they are doing it, and I know who's behind it." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I explained what I'd found, the resin, the accelerants, the deliberate manipulation of time. I spoke of the organization, their resources, their twisted ambition. The detective listened, his eyes widening with each revelation, the pieces of his own investigation clicking into place. "So, it's not just about misdirection," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "It's about creating a false timeline, a ghost of evidence." "Exactly," I confirmed. "They're not trying to hide the evidence, they're trying to create the wrong evidence. They want us chasing shadows, looking for clues that aren't there while they continue their work unimpeded." He paced for a moment, the sterile floor creaking under his weight. "This organization, you're sure?" "As sure as I am that a fly lays eggs and those eggs hatch," I replied. The analogy felt inadequate, but it was the only way I knew how to explain it. "Their methods are sophisticated, but the underlying principles are still biological. They are just..." We were no longer just investigating murders. We were confronting a conspiracy that threatened to rewrite the rules of justice itself. "What do we do now?" the detective asked, his gaze fixed on me, a flicker of hope mixed with apprehension. I looked back at the bodies, at the silent testament to the killer's cruelty. My isolation, my reclusion, it had been a shield, protecting me from the world, from the pain of the past. But it had also blinded me. "We expose them," I said, my voice resonating with a newfound purpose. "We use their own science against them. We show the world what they are and what they're capable of. This isn't just about solving these murders anymore. It's about ensuring that no one else can ever twist the truth in such a horrific way again." The detective nodded, a grim resolve hardening his features. "Then let's get to work." As we left the morgue at capacity after mass casualty event, the hum of the lights seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet roar of determination. The case was far from over, the fight against the organization just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, a clarity of purpose. My passion for entomology, once a solitary pursuit, had found its true calling not just in understanding the cycle of life and death, but in defending it.